Thank you for choosing to wake up with us this morning on Sunrise at Sea, and thank you for sticking around. You're just in time for Twitter Jabs, and this is the second segment where we actually have a guest at the center of this conversation. However, disclaimer, or a word of, I do not know, Sandra Cope, I need to test that Caesar salad. It's a Friday, so please deliver all the way to Chaliwa Jalana Mugongo. That is where you can find me. But moving on to the conversation today, and what we're discussing today is in regard to Tororo woman MP, that is none other than Sarah Opendi, who made a move that was on the Wednesday, February 9th, 2022, made a successful motion to seek to address the problem of many public schools funded by government charging exorbitant fees prices. And of course, exorbitant fees, I beg your pardon. And joining me at the center of the conversation is none other than Miss Elizabeth Atori, and she is the legal officer at Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
How are you?
Oh, I'm great. But I'm actually more excited to start having this conversation with you, and thank you for hosting me.
Oh, thank you also for honoring our invitation. So let's cut right to the chase. Now, according to your findings, and I'm very aware, and I've been reading some of the reports that people of your team have been sending out from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights in regard to the exorbitant fees that is being charged by government-aided schools. So what, according to that, especially when it comes to aided schools, what are your findings and what is causing it?
Well, first of all, we need to have a deep dive into what the current education system is like in this country.
Okay.
Given the fact that we don't only have government-aided schools, we have public schools, and then we have the solely private schools. So the issue around exorbitant fees is not one that is specific to government-aided schools. But the challenge around having government-aided schools charge exorbitant fees is something that is out of this world, given the fact that the government does input public resources into these schools. They are paying the teachers that are teaching at these particular schools. Mm-hmm. They are supporting the schools, giving them maybe development fees or providing some money of the capitation grant to these schools. So you find that you start to ask yourself, if these schools are getting public resources given to them by the government, why then are they charging such exorbitant fees? The minister, Sarah Opendi, said these schools charge as much as even universities. So think about the big giants in this country in terms of education. You're thinking Nabisonsa, you're thinking Gayaza, you're thinking Namagunga, Budo. All these schools are getting some sort of funding from the government. But in terms of their fees structure, you don't see this funding reflected in low fees for the students to be able to ensure that there is access. And originally, the idea to fund these schools was to ensure that there is access to education for all, given the fact that the government thought at that time that they were unable to build their own schools and get learners into those schools. And so the plan was, let's divert some resources into these schools so that then schools are more accessible to everyone. So you see, the intention was good, but the challenge currently is we do not see this in terms of equity. Vulnerable people are not able to access these schools. Even in schools in the outskirts of Kampala, let's say Tororo Girls or Teso College, Iloit, you find that even for these particular schools, the communities around are unable to. So what you find is that the urban people within urban centers are then sending their children to these schools. So that really is the issue.
Okay.
Why does government put money into these schools, and why isn't the school fees structure reflected? And shouldn't the government then instead invest in their own schools, public schools?
Elizabeth, I do understand where you're coming from. However, when myself and Sandra were looking at some of the tweets that were coming in, and this particular tweet from Mugoya Musa did catch my attention, and he mentioned and highlighted that while we are busy complaining that government-funded schools or government-owned schools are raising fees, is because they're trying to, also raise the standard of education that our children are receiving. So if you're complaining that they're increasing fees and you expect them to have the same quality of education as those in private schools, then then that's a recipe for disaster. What's your take on that?
But you see, that argument then assumes that the government-aided schools that are able to provide proper education, quality education, like let's say Kololo SS, are not actually then providing quality education. It's not that a school that charges a high amount of fees is providing the best quality education for children. We've seen this for so many times. You've seen that even the students that get out of these schools, the quality of education is questionable. So what really drives this is the profit motive around schools, the fact that education has been commercialized in this country, and that education is no longer viewed as a basic right, something that everyone has the right to attain, but instead providing education services is looked at as a way of getting profit. Schools, even the government-aided schools, now have to support their systems by getting loans in the bank. If you find a school that has to get a loan in the bank, that school is not going to bring down their school fees charges. So really what you have is a problem in the system that needs to be fixed. And my solution would be, let's just invest in public schools, get the quality of education from our schools that are publicly funded, instead of investing public funds into private institutions that are for profit.
Okay, so looking at the fact that woman MP Honorable Sarah Pendi did table a motion to Parliament, and also, of course, I'm aware that also your organization did appear before High Court yesterday. Has anything been done so far?
Well, the motion was tabled in Parliament and now is before the Committee on Education in Parliament. And this will give an opportunity for the general public to participate, but also for the committee to ask pertinent questions. What is the state of education in this country? I know there is a review around the whole education system, and they were calling for people to be able to participate in the Ministry of Education. But these questions need to be asked, and I think it's a good platform to start with, the committee really delving deep into what you've asked me. Why is the situation as is? Why don't we have regulation in terms of the exorbitant charges? And perhaps that's a question that we need to ask. Why are these schools unilaterally sitting down, their board of governors sitting down and deciding, oh, this term will increase by 50%, or we'll ask the parents to pay a top-up on top of the school fees, and then we'll ask for this ridiculous list of requirements: cement, paint, might be building fees. Why are these schools able to do this without the Ministry of Education coming up and regulating it, without the Ministry of Education stopping it? And I know the ministry has said that it has been issuing circulars to schools, but regulation can't stop at circulars that have no sanctions, right? Because for a law to be effective in this particular case, there needs to be a little bit of bite, something that stops them from going beyond what the circular says. And in this case, the solution would be to have a regulation in place, to have a law in place that provides a sanction of sorts. If you go beyond these particular fees, if you don't follow these particular guidelines, you should be able to be answerable for your actions as an institution.
Okay, so earlier on when you were talking about cement library fee, I had a smile from ear to ear because you took me back to my school days. However, in your capacity as legal officer, is this an issue that is more prominent in public or private schools?
Well, it's prominent in all schools. The challenge is UPE and universal secondary education should be free according to the policies of this government. So a child should be able to walk into a universal primary education school and shouldn't have to pay through the teeth requirements to the tune of, let's say, 200,000 or to a particular amount. For the vulnerable communities, even charging 10,000 parent-teacher association fees is a very big challenge to them. So we found that we've been receiving testimonies from parents who at first had their children in private schools before COVID. But given the fact that COVID has showed us that the scales of vulnerability have tipped in this country, it doesn't matter whether you might have been well off before the pandemic. So many people after the pandemic have been unable to support their families, let alone now, given the reopening of the schools, take the children to school. So parents have had a situation where they can't afford private schools, but even the government schools that are near them are unaffordable to them because they have to pay requirements. And the challenge with these requirements is the schools just come up with them and state them. There is a lack of participation on the end of the parents. There is nothing that the parents can do in terms of even getting remedy. And you must report with the requirements. Some schools have gone as far as getting books or textbooks and labeling them and saying, you must buy these books from this particular school. You have to buy, might be a suitcase from this school. And yet if you go outside in the open economy, these items cost less than what they are charging in schools. So what you have is a system that can't be beaten. And that leaves the parents in a situation where they have no option but to leave their children back at home. For those that have tried even to move their children from the schools, because I was talking to a parent yesterday, they say now they have to take the kid to a nearby teacher whom we are not even sure is qualified to be able to provide particular learning for their kids. But you see, there are questions around concerns around the fact that there is no license in that place. What conditions are these children learning in? And as a country, is this where we want our education system to
be going to?
Yes.
So do you think this has deprived many Ugandans and students from accessing education? Of course, looking at some of the findings from ISER, do you think this is actually a leading cause as to why people are being deprived of education because they cannot afford it?
Definitely. And I'll use government data on this. 6 out of 10 children that are out of school have reported the cost of education being the reason why.
The leading cause.
The leading cause for them being out of school. So you see, the cost of education is a very big factor that determines access to education. And that's why when the government decided to commence UPE, to commence Uganda Universal Secondary Education, it was a good move with great intentions. But currently the system as is such that we don't have a UPE in this school. We don't have USE in this country because the charges that are associated in terms of non-tuition charges, the requirements, development fees, getting parents to have to get these particular things from a particular school is really preventing access
to education.
Yes.
Okay, so looking at the findings and research, and I'm sure you do data analysis, community analysis, and you compare different findings with countries all over the world. Are there countries that you think Uganda can emulate and pick a leaf from in regard when it comes to the education system and making sure that it's not just accessible, but it's also affordable to all students at large?
I would say this. The first question that we need to ask ourselves in this particular context is, do we have an overhaul of this education system? Do we actually want to support private actors that are providing education in terms of giving them aid from government?
Yes.
Or do we as a country want to move to a place where our public education system works, where children are able to walk into a public school and not worry about the fact that they're going to sit on the floors, and not worry about overcrowding, and not worry about the fact that the teachers are less. So even in terms of benchmarking, these are the countries that we need to look to. And I might not say particularly that this particular country is, but there are so many things that we can pick from different perspectives, particularly in terms of financing for public education and making sure that we reclaim our public services as a country.
Okay, so as we wind up this conversation on Twitter Jabs this morning, what are your last remarks in regard to the issue at hand?
My last remarks are these. As Ugandans, we can't afford to just sit back and watch the situation move from worse to even worse. In 2017, as an organization, we filed a petition before the Committee on Education at Parliament. And the exact issue that we are highlighting now, the exorbitant tuition and non-tuition charges that are charged by government-aided schools, was what we tabled during this particular time. But it has taken how many years for Parliament to actually now have a motion that the committee is going to sit and see. And perhaps this time they'll be able to come up with a report, because the last time we didn't receive any feedback after that motion was tabled. So as Ugandans, what is our role in this case? We need to stand up and be able to ask the government, to hold the government accountable as a duty bearer, to ensure that the government is able to provide education for its citizens, for Ugandans, to ensure that people are able to walk into a public school, get quality education, not have to worry about the cost of education in this country. So this is an area which we need to focus on. It's an area that we need to prioritize as a country. Okay. And I hope we are all getting on board. All stakeholders should get on board on this. It's not just about civil society coming and pushing government, but even as a parent, even as a concerned citizen, it's something that you can do. You can use the mechanisms that are in place. There are so many social accountability mechanisms that have been put in place in this country to ask pertinent questions about your child's right to education. Why are these costs being charged? To even come and join us and rally behind this course.
Don't just receive a letter from the school and then they're telling you development fees this, and then you say, okay, we shall pay, go to the bank. I think parents need to ask some of these questions.
They really do, and not just stop at crying about it. Because the challenge with fees is it's continuous. Yes, we finished the first term after the reopening of COVID-19, but the situation is not going to change for next term. The issue of school fees is not an issue of COVID-19. It started way before COVID-19, these exorbitant charges. It's only that now that COVID-19 has tipped the scales of vulnerability that you find that even those that were comfortable paying these high school fees costs are now questioning why we have these costs. So it's an issue that is important. It's an issue that we need to prioritize and look into.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us on this conversation on Sunrise at Sea and giving us more insight as to what is expected in regard to the